Have you ever been talking to someone about something and they just completely misunderstand what you're saying? Can you remember being frustrated and asking yourself, how can they not understand? Well, stay tuned and I'll explain up next on Apologetics for You. Well, welcome back to another teaching on understanding apologetics with Apologetics for You, where our goal is to bring the conversation to everyday people. I'm Tank, founder of Apologetics for You and pastor of Reach City Church in Cleveland, Ohio. And today we're going to look at worldviews. We're going to talk about what is it, why understanding them matters, and how do we even identify one. And one of the things when you talk about worldviews that must be understood is that worldviews are the things that shape our perspectives. Have you ever been having a conversation with somebody and aggravated, confused on how you can be saying the things that you're saying and they're just completely missing it, completely misunderstanding it? Well, the answer is because everybody brings different perspectives to every conversation. Right? Those perspectives are things that we can call worldviews in apologetics, or those things that shape where a person comes from or how a person understands it. In fact, Brandon Washington in Urban Apologetics, Restoring Black Dignity with the Gospel, he defined a worldview as a scheme of foundational beliefs that serve as a lens through which we receive and interpret reality. Simply put, it's the filter in which people see things through. A worldview is the filter in which you and I see the world and reality through. So, what shapes a worldview? Well, there's many things that shape our worldview, and typically they're those things that have a lot of value in our life, and those things that have value begin to influence our life according to the amount of value that they have in our life. For example, when it comes to hard candy, I grew up loving Boston baked beans. I think it's a great hard candy because me and my dad would eat Boston baked beans while driving in the truck together. So it has a sentimental value to me. However, I'm not going to argue that with somebody. If somebody doesn't think that Boston baked beans aren't the best candy in the world, that's on them. I'm not going to argue it. In other words, it doesn't have a lot of influence in the everyday decisions that I make in life. Now, on the other end, when we talk about things about the important role of a father in the life of his children, I will die on that hill, right? I will argue the importance of a father and that his role is just as essential as a mother's role. And the reason I will die on that hill is because I am a child who was raised by his father, not his mother. And so the effects of a father in my life are felt more. And I respect dads to this level because I was raised by a dad. And because of that, my worldview on the importance of a father is shaped based upon that. Now, somebody who may not have been raised by a father, whose father may have been absent in their life, they may feel different about the importance of a father in their life. But because of where I come from, that holds a value in my life, and therefore it influences how I see life and family a lot more. That's the power of a worldview. And so when we want to get into conversations with people in apologetics, understanding the level of influence that a person or a value has on a person is essential to the discipline of apologetics. Understanding a worldview is essential to the discipline of apologetics. The first reason is because in a debate, you have to be self-aware enough to know if you are arguing facts or value, right? When we talk about this later, you'll understand more, but essentially facts are those things that make a worldview credible. And many of people get into these debates, and if you listen, they aren't actually arguing facts, they're arguing value. One way to identify is if somebody continues to talk about their experience. Typically, our experience helps to shape our worldview, and this plays a part in shaping how we see and understand life. But it's also important to understand this because it's essential when we defend in the Christian faith, because you don't want to debate things that mean something to you but aren't true in relationship to the faith. And many people do that. Now, the second reason that this is important is because you need to be able to identify what the person you are speaking to is arguing from. Right? This reason is key because understanding influence of value can stop you from unintentionally shutting the door on a conversation because you attacked a value of high influence in a person's life. What do I mean? We'll take Islam, for example, and maybe you're talking to somebody and you're trying to convince them that the Christian faith is more plausible as a religion that can connect you to God, but you begin to say things like, what you heard that from is a lie, and where you got that from is a lie. And maybe this person's entire Islamic influence was their parents, and maybe their parents deceased. Well, what that person hears is that their parents were liars. Their parents lied to them. The parents deceived them. And so right at that point, reason and rationale is no longer what you are talking about with that person. That person is now defending their parents' honor because now the Islamic faith is more than just about beliefs, right? And presuppositions and plausibility, but it's now connected to the love that they have for their parents. And so you need to be able to identify if you're arguing facts with the person or value, because if you begin to argue value, you may be unintentionally shutting the door on a conversation because the connection to that value is so important to them. Knowing this doesn't mean that you don't speak truth, but if the goal is to move the conversation forward, you can now approach the conversation in a way that allows the door of reason to stay open so that you may be able to create plausibility in the mind of the person. Worldviews have values, and based on the level of influence they have on a person, it determines the ease or difficulty that you may have to move a person to change. And so there's many different things that impact our worldview. I've already stated that experience, but the other is for others, and wider, he explains it this way. Our parents, right? From birth, parents begin to shape, good or bad, how a child grows up in life. Our peers, right? Who we associate with plays a role in shaping our worldviews. This is why for parents, it is critical that we guard the friendship that our children have when they're in that impressionable age. Our teachers and coaches play another role in developing a worldview in children trust their teachers, and they've been told that they are authority, that they know something. And so children grow up holding to the opinions and the words of their teachers. In fact, for Christians, this is why as the times shift and things get to moving that we may be against, the conversation is growing increasingly on if we should homeschool our children. And the reason is because we understand the importance that a teacher has in shaping the worldview of our children. And do we want to be entrusting our children to somebody who teaches and holds and presses those things that go against our faith? I'm not saying yes or no to this. I'm just saying that the conversation exists because parents understand the essential role that children have in shaping a worldview. Another one is the media. The media is another source, and I'm going to argue that is probably the more serious source because our children spend so much time in front of a screen listening to music and on social media. They are constantly being challenged and developed in their worldview. And lastly, religion. Religion impacts the development of a person's worldview. Typical religions have a sacred text, and in that text, it instructs a person on how they should live and act. And based on that person's understanding of the text, it begins to be the lens in which they see and operate in life. But why does a worldview even matter? Why should we take the time as apologists to care about their worldview? Well, one person said that the government doesn't take time studying counterfeit dollars. They just get to know their dollars so that they can see a counterfeit from a mile away. And I'm not really sure if that's true. But one thing that I do know is, yes, it is true that we should know our worldview through and through. That's why the beginning of apologetics is understanding what you believe. However, at the same time, as an apologist, if I never spend time at least having a foundational understanding of these other worldviews, how can I ever press the conversation forward? How can I ever enter the conversation where they are? If debate happens to occur because two people are entering the conversation from two different frameworks, then it is essential for the apologist to be able to identify quickly the worldview. Why? Well, because I want to quickly see where they're coming from so that I can enter into the conversation from a place that makes sense to them. You can't debate a Hebrew Israelite the same way you debate an atheist. And you shouldn't debate someone considering abortion by rape the same way that you would engage a person considering abortion because they just had unprotected sex and doesn't want the baby. Nor would you engage that conversation the same way that you would engage a person who thinks that a baby is actually violating a woman's body. Same conversation, but based on where they're coming from, you enter that conversation differently. And when we understand a person's worldview, we get to understand where they're coming from so that we as the apologists can enter into the conversation more effectively. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to look at 5 key questions that you should be asking that will help you to identify where a person is coming from and what worldview they hold. And I'll demonstrate this by looking at 3 worldviews as a case study. There's more. There's about 7 worldviews in total, but there's 3 kind of popular and well-known worldviews. And so those 3 worldviews that we're going to look at is naturalism. The naturalists believe that God does not exist. And they believe that knowledge and existence can only be answered through the natural lens, nothing supernatural. Many scientists are naturalists. They deny miracles and anything supernatural. The second one is pantheism. Pantheism is a religion like Hinduism or Buddhism and the growing New Age movement and the whole spiritualist movement. And it involves reverence of the universe over the creator and not seeing the creator as a personal God. Then you have theism, right? And theism is the belief that God exists. I am a theist. If you're watching this, maybe you're a theist. We believe that God exists. And there are many different religions that fall under the umbrella of theism, but all of us agree that God exists. And so these are those 3 basic worldviews that we're going to use as a case study as we look at these 5 questions that if we learn to ask these questions, they will help us to identify a person's worldview. First, it's the question of origin. Right? This question asks, how did life begin and how did mankind come into existence? You'll be able to identify easily if a person is a theist because they will conclude that everything that exists, God the creator created. Right? But the naturalists will answer this question a little bit different because they start by rejecting God. Right? So they're going to answer the question of origin not from God because they reject that God even exists. Right? Leading scientists and that may be atheists like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins both suggest that God is not necessary for life. For the naturalist, the answer to the origins of life is found in nature, not God. So they'll look to science. You'll hear things like evolution, right? These are how naturalists explain the origins of life. Now, the pantheists, they're a little bit different, and there's not really a consensus throughout their whole worldview, but because pantheists claim that God and the universe are the same, for them, life never had a beginning. Rather, everything has always been in existence as a part of God, right? And so this can be a little bit trickier, but essentially, you want to be listening for words like the universe or it was always or we just are, right? They're going to answer the question of origin as there is no origin to life. We have always been. The universe is eternal and we are one with the universe. And so we have always been eternal with the universe. Secondly, you have the question of identity. The question of identity is simply, what does it mean to be human? Specifically, what does it say about humanity? Is there something special about us or not? Right? Now, the naturalists, they're going to answer this question, though they'll never admit it. They'll never admit it. But for them, humanity means nothing. right? The naturalist believes in evolution. This means that they believe there's no distinction between animals and humans, right? Outside of sophistication. In other words, humans are just an intelligent animal. We've evolved past their level, past the animal's level of sophistication, but essentially we're just intelligent animals. In fact, Peter Singer, who was a professor of bioethics at Princeton, he stated this, that mankind should have no privilege over animals. He's even quoted as stating that the unborn baby and a newborn is less valuable than the life of a pig. See, a naturalist will more than likely be pro-choice. Why? Having a fit if an animal is killed. The pantheists, well, they're going to be similar to the naturalists, and that all life is sacred to them as well. But where they differ is that they focus more on the soul, not the life. And so they find a distinction between human life and animal life based upon the soul, but not necessarily based on life as itself. Right? For the pantheists, being an animal is just a lower life form, and it's a curse for those who live lives where they were not able to actually reach nirvana. And so they had to go back through the cycle of reincarnation. And so, again, for them, humans have value over animals, but really in the soul level, not necessarily in the living level, if that makes sense to you. Now, the theists, we're going to hold that mankind is special above all creation, right? But we're more special than the animals because we're the only people that God said he is going to make in his image and his likeness. So if you ask the theists about mankind, we're going to talk about intrinsic human value. We're going to talk about superiority over all other creatures because God created us to rule over them in Genesis 2:15. Right? And if you talk about humans, we're going to talk about in relationship to animals and creation, we're something special, as the psalmist in chapter 8 looks to all of God's wonderful creation. And he concludes this, God, what is man that you care for us? In other words, with all of the beauty and everything that you created, why are we so special to you? The theist sees human life as completely set apart from every other of God's creation. The third question that you want to ask is, meaning and purpose, right? This is going to ask, why do we exist, right? What's the purpose of life? For the naturalists, well, they don't really have any answer that's logically consistent with their belief. And what I mean by that is if you believe in evolution, then you don't believe that we were intentionally created. We just so happen to be created by an accident, and accidents can't have purpose. So while the naturalists may desire to answer this question, the moment they begin to answer the question of purpose, they begin to contradict their own worldview. But for the sake of the conversation, a naturalist will focus on things like legacy leaving. They will focus on the purpose of mankind is to better the world for the next evolutionary strand before they leave. And so they'll talk about legacy and leaving the world in the best condition for the generation to follow them. Now, the pantheist is going to answer this question a lot different. The purpose for the pantheist is nirvana, right? And nirvana expresses this state of liberation from the bondage of the earthly life and the earthly mindset. It's understanding that you are one with the universe. You are the creator. You are God. And so for the pantheist, the purpose is enlightenment, to be awakened, to shed the bondage of thinking that even what you see even exists, right? That's the whole purpose for pantheism, nirvana, liberation, right? People who say, you're a God. These are people who hold a pantheistic worldview. In fact, it was right in front of us. We never would have seen it. But when you look at how great the movie Matrix was, it was nothing but pushing Hinduism. Why? Because it's the idea that nothing around us really exists. And the goal of life was to be what? Unplugged from the Matrix and realize what is actually real. That is Hinduism. Now, for the theists, it's our belief that the purpose of mankind is to know God and to glorify God. Regardless of what theistic sect may exist, the goal is to know God and to glorify God. There's another question that you want to ask is about morality and ethics. This question asks, what is right and what is wrong and how should I live? Now, interesting enough, Wider states that this question is hard to answer in any worldview that does not presuppose God. And I agree. Right? If there's no creator, how can we know what is right and wrong? If there's no creator, right and wrong is based on rational hedonism, or the idea that self-interest and personal happiness is the goal of all actions. So the naturalists, they're most likely going to answer this question in a familiar way. It's a familiar term, relativism, right? It's the idea that what is good or bad is not absolute or having any value for morality. Rather, it's relative, right? Meaning subject to change based on the individual. Now, obviously, you can see where this creates a problem. If good is based on what is best for me, what happens when what is best for somebody else is to rob me so that they can pay their bills? So in this worldview, evil is good if it's best for society, right? The naturalist view is part why slavery exists, right? It's because they deemed that slavery was best for the society. Kidnapping was best for the society. Now, it obviously was not, but when evil people are left to determine what is good, slavery and other evil systems are deemed good and necessary. Now, the pantheists would answer this question kind of the same way, but more in an individualistic focus. Remember, the pantheist believes that everything is God and God is in everything. Therefore, morality and ethics is determined by looking within. Where theists would say it's determined by God, the pantheists would agree. But because they believe they're God, they're going to say that they are the ones who can actually determine what is right and wrong. What is best for me is what is right. What is best for me is what is wrong, or what is not best for me is what is wrong. Essentially, this is rational hedonism, right? But it's just focused on the individual, right? By the way, if you pay attention, it should be very clear how much of this language is just wrapped up in the church culture. It's crazy when you understand these things. You begin to see how secular the thought of the believer is over biblical thought. But lastly, the theists, right? They're going to answer this question by saying according to what God has revealed in our religious text. Now, this religious text may differ from different theistic groups, but essentially we're turning to what God revealed as the gauge for what is good and what is bad, what is good and what is evil. Now, the religious text may differ, but we're operating from that place that God is the one determining what is good and what is evil. And the last one is the question of destiny. This question asks, what happens when we die? And more specifically, what happens to me when I die? This is perhaps one of the most essential questions because the answer will directly affect how people live. For example, in 1 Corinthians 15, when those who did not believe there was actually a bodily resurrection from the dead, they said, what? Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Essentially, what they were saying was, listen, get the most out of your desires in life, because after this, there's nothing. And so because they didn't believe in a life after death, they felt the need to get it all now. And so it affected how they live today. What we think about the afterlife affects how we live and treat each other today. For the naturalists, they would hold to the thoughts just mentioned because they're going to say that there is nothing after death. The goal of the naturalists is to leave a legacy for the people after you, right? There's nothing for you. It's just about what do you leave for the next person, right? Purpose, even though they shouldn't have purpose, right? But anyway, this is why you'll hear people say, atheists are better good Samaritans than even Christians. And though it should not be so, the reality is because in their worldview, the focus of their life is to leave the world better. And so they're going to serve the world better. They're going to get involved in more community service than probably most Christians will. Now, the pantheists, they're a little confused about this because while there is life after death, the reincarnation and karma, their ultimate goal is to end the cycle of reincarnation. So they acknowledge that there's life after death, but the goal of their worldview is to end that life after death until you reach this place of nirvana, until you reach this place of extinction, because that's what nirvana means. But in the meantime, the pantheists, like the atheists, they're going to do a lot of good things that's going to appear to be good because it's going to affect them. And because nirvana is affected by how you live your life. Reincarnation, becoming a lower life form, is affected by how you live your life. They call that karma. Now, the theists, we believe that after death, we enter this eternal state, and that state is based on different things by different sects. But the reality is we believe that there is life after death. There is an eternity for our life. And we can either spend that time with God or we can spend that time apart from God. Some will call that hell. Some will not call it hell. Regardless of what they're calling it, the idea is still the same. There is life after death, and how we live on this side of the world affects that. Now, the Christians will go further, and we're going to say that it's faith apart from works. Most other sects are going to say, it's just based on what you do in this life. But the reality is we believe that there is life after death. So these are the 5 basic questions. The question of origin, value, purpose, morality, and destiny. All worldviews are going to answer these questions, and having a basic understanding of how different worldviews answer these questions will be essential in helping you identify who you are talking to. Remember, the goal was not for me to give an exhaustive look at these, but to demonstrate these questions and to show how different worldviews answer them differently. But I just wanted to give you some tools today to understand the importance of asking questions so that you can understand where a person is coming from, so that you can engage the conversation in a way that is effective. And so worldviews are what shape what people believe and how they see life. And so when we're talking to somebody, we want to understand what their worldview is by asking those 5 questions and listening to how they answer them. And then you want to engage that conversation based upon their worldview so that you can move the conversation forward in an effective way. Listen, next week, we'll talk about the criteria for these worldviews. How do we judge if a worldview is right or wrong? And there's some criteria for this, and we're going to look at it next week. But for now, hit that like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you next week on Apologetics for You.